Kia ora e te whānau o iho karaiti. Today we're looking at the Gospel for Sunday the 13th of November 2022, and it's Luke chapter 21 verses 5 through to 19. This reading is set in Holy Week, that last week of Jesus' life where he ministers most days in the temple. Not long to go before he's arrested and tried and executed. And so here we pick up the narrative, Luke chapter 21 verse 5. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left on another, all will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and 'the time is near.' Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify, so make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance. For I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your souls." Now, as we read on through the Luke account, we see that what he's talking about here is all a prelude. It's a prelude in the text to his return at a coming time. Everything leads up to this moment. Now, it's interesting that because later on we see that when people pronounced those words that Jesus is coming back, they became skeptical very quickly. Even a few short years later, Peter, writing to the fledgling church in his second letter, says, "You must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, 'Where is this coming he promised? Ever since our fathers died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation.'" And this was nearly 2,000 years ago. It still hasn't happened. Jesus has yet to come on the clouds of heaven, yet the church has continued to grow over the centuries, continued to be a force for good, a source for transformation of individuals and societies. As people have learned to trust Christ over the centuries, they have been brought from death to life, from darkness to light, from despair to hope. Countless millions of lives have been transformed. And so it is today. So when we read this passage that we had from the Gospel this morning, we tend to cast things that Jesus is warning us about into our own future. Yet 2,000 years later, much of this has already happened, and I suspect will keep happening. Verses 12 to 17, for example, are historical. Just listen to the words again. "But before all this occurs, all the other dreadful things, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. This is the story of certainly the earlier, perhaps no, the whole of the book of Acts. And much of it is centered at the beginning and ultimately the end, on the flip side, around Saul of Tarsus, who becomes Paul the Apostle to the Gentiles. We encounter him in chapter 9, breathing out murderous threats against the followers of Jesus. He has them arrested. He takes them prisoner. He has some of them, as we read later, as he tells about his former life, some of them he persecutes to the point that they actually die. They actually get executed. And yet it's him who we read about ultimately appearing before regional governors, before King Agrippa, and ultimately before the Caesar, the emperor in Rome himself. All of this is part of the history of the Christian church. And we see Jesus warning of these things that are going to happen as the people are talking about the magnificence, the wonder, the permanence, or so it would seem, of this temple, which to date had taken 46 years to build. And there's a sense of saying, look how good God has been. Look how gracious God has been. Look at this thing. We can trust that God is going to look after us into the future, because look at this. And Jesus says, no. He said, this thing's going to come down. Even it can't be trusted. And less than 40 years later, they've been building it for longer, less than 40 years later, it was destroyed. Not one stone left upon another. There are no guarantees. There will always be challenges for the followers of Jesus. And Jesus is warning us not to be surprised. For many of us, so often when things go wrong, we imagine that we're being punished, that God has in some way given up on us. Or this just isn't what we signed up for. We had an expectation that if we were going to follow Jesus, that everything's going to be wonderful, car pie, it's going to be straightforward and glorious. Life will be filled with prosperity, sweetness and joy. Not so. Not so, says Jesus. Jesus normalizes struggle. He normalizes opposition. He normalizes that life for his followers is going to be difficult. It's the narrow way. It's the steep climb. It's the small door that we've got to press through. That in the words of M. Scott Peck in the beginning of one of his books, I think it's The Road Less Travelled, life is difficult. And so as we struggle with that, there's a tendency for us to blame. And if we're not blaming ourselves, we then blame others. And often to the point where we demonize them. When things are difficult for us, we can expect opposition to the point that it becomes a form of wish fulfillment. We can end up validating the narrative that we are victims, that we are being persecuted for our faith. And there's a huge part of the evangelical community in the United States of America now who are doing exactly that. They're doubling down and they're claiming to be followers of Jesus, yet they are spewing out hurtful and hateful rhetoric against vulnerable people groups who cannot readily defend themselves, all in the name of righteousness, all in the name for standing up for what they believe is their entitlement and their right. And then they claim that they're being persecuted. They complain about it when there is pushback. Any opposition is therefore seen as persecution of the righteous, them. It's difficult. That could be us, that could be you, this could be me. There's a fine line here to be trod. There are no guarantees. And the truth is that we all experience periods of difficulties through our life. I imagine there's something wrong if we don't. For some, difficulty and struggle seems to be a feature of their life. I can think of a small number of people who it's just one thing after another after another. And I have no explanation for it. I have none. The question for all of us, though, is how do we handle it? And Jesus, in verse 19, just simply encourages us to hold on. But I think there's more than just holding on. He gives us a clue, I want to suggest, to what holding on looks like and what the requirements for holding on are in verses 14 and 15. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, he says. For I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. We see evidence of this where Peter and John are arrested and appear before the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 4. The Sanhedrin are the religious leaders of Israel. In verse 13 of chapter 4 it says, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished and took note that these men had been with Jesus. The effect of being with Jesus is revolutionary. It's transformative. It gives us a grace and a wisdom that is just not accessible in any other way. And I'm sure that it was the approach that Paul took when he stood in those places of judgment, as we see from his arrest in the latter parts of the book of Acts, ultimately leading up to his standing before Caesar, the emperor, the Roman emperor, later saying that I was delivered out of the lion's mouth, as he gives testimony to the way of Jesus to the very top court in Roman society. The early church described itself as people of the way. That's it. The way. They didn't have a fancy name. They didn't have a fancy label. We're just people of the way. We see it again and again in the book of Acts. It's easy to miss it. We're so locked in to the Christian church. But Christian, as a title, is a later invention. It says they were first called Christians at Antioch, and that comes a good way through the gospel, through the book of the book of Acts. And I want to suggest that there's something that happens when we move from something that is fluid and at work like the way to something that is a noun and static like Christians. It's like it's got locked in some way. It's become moving something from open and vital and living to something that is a concept, an idea, a system of beliefs that one gives mental assent to. And it's clear in the way that we understand faith. The verb, the Greek word pistio, to believe, means also to trust. It's used 241 times in the New Testament. Yet it's overwhelmingly interpreted as belief, which in our post-Enlightenment age is primarily a commitment of the head, of what's between our ears, of giving mental assent to a certain set of propositions. The sense of the word, though, is just as strongly to trust. And I've spoken about this before, but it's important, and I'm happy to repeat myself. Then to trust is more an activity, I want to suggest, of the heart. I find the idea of being required to believe certain concepts about Jesus much more challenging than simply trusting him. And it's about following the way of Jesus. I can trust Jesus and his way. And I want to suggest there's an interconnectedness then between us as followers of the way and the Spirit of God, who leads us by the Spirit. It's not just about what we believe in our heads. It's about a graced awareness of God at work in the moment, in every moment. So it's not, when he says that we need to hang on in there, it's not just about white knuckling and gritting our teeth. This is about a way of being connected, a way of being with God in the moment, which flows into our behaviour of how we are before God and before others, and to quiet confidence that we're not alone in this. So Jesus, I want to suggest, in a funny way in this passage, is inviting us to trust him, not to fret, not to rehearse, simply to walk moment by moment in this awareness of his presence with us, and to trust in him that he will see us through the challenges and the curveballs that life inevitably will throw at us. God bless you.